In the quiet hill town of San Aurelio, evenings always arrived softly. The sun would sink behind the distant ridges and leave the stone houses glowing in amber light for a few short minutes before the streets turned blue with shadow. The bell of the old church rang at the same hour every day. Swallows crossed the square in wide circles. The smell of warm bread drifted from the bakery near the fountain. By nightfall, shutters closed, voices faded behind thick walls, and the whole town seemed to breathe more slowly, as if darkness itself asked for silence. Nothing remarkable ever happened there. That was one of the reasons Carmen Valdez had never wanted to leave. She was 72 years old, small and straight-backed, with silver hair pinned carefully at the nape of her neck and hands made rough by a lifetime of sweeping floors, kneading dough, tending flowers, and mending what could not afford to be replaced. She had lived in the same whitewashed house at the edge of San Aurelio for more than 50 years. Her husband, Esteban, had built the courtyard garden behind it stone by stone when they were still young. He planted jasmine along the rear wall, rosemary in wide clay pots, and a narrow row of white roses that somehow survived both winter frost and summer drought. At the center of that courtyard stood a small statue of the Virgin Mary. It was not ancient. It was not grand. It was not carved by any famous hand. It was simply a modest figure of pale stone, softened by years of rain and sun, with lowered eyes, open hands, and a calm sadness in the shape of its face. Esteban had bought it decades earlier after the couple lost their first child before birth. Carmen still remembered the journey home from the monastery shop high in the hills, how neither of them had spoken much, and how carefully he carried the statue wrapped in blankets as though it were something fragile and living. "She belongs among flowers," he had said quietly, and so she remained there. For years the statue watched over everything. It stood through spring rains and August heat. It stood while neighborhood children ran laughing past the open gate. It stood while candles flickered at its feet on feast days, and while Carmen sat on the old wooden bench beside it in the long golden evenings, drinking tea and listening to the birds settle into the fig tree. To the people of San Aurelio, the statue was simply part of Carmen's courtyard. To Carmen, it was something more difficult to name. It was memory. It was grief that had stopped feeling sharp and turned instead into a quiet ache, softened by time and routine. It was one of the few things that connected the life she had now to the life she had once imagined she would have forever. Then, in the summer of 2024, her granddaughter came to stay. Lucia was 7 years old and had the serious eyes of a child who noticed details adults often missed. She arrived with a small yellow suitcase, a cardigan tied around her shoulders despite the heat, and a stuffed rabbit missing one button eye. Her parents had gone abroad for work for several weeks, and San Aurelio felt to her, at first, like a place from another century. The streets were too quiet. The stars looked too bright. The church bells woke her in the mornings. At night, she said the silence made her hear her own thoughts too loudly. But she loved the courtyard immediately. On the first day, she followed Carmen everywhere, asking about every plant, every stone, every crack in the wall. Why did rosemary smell stronger when the air was warm? Why did the jasmine bloom more on one side than the other? Why did the wooden bench creak only when someone leaned left? Who planted the fig tree? And then, all at once, she stopped in front of the statue. "Who is she?" Lucia asked. Carmen looked toward the pale figure standing among the roses. "That is the Virgin Mary." Lucia tilted her head and studied the statue for a long moment without speaking. "She looks sad," the child finally said. Carmen smiled faintly. "Maybe she is thinking about people." Lucia seemed satisfied with that answer, but from then on she paid the statue unusual attention. She sat beside it with her drawing pad. She left small flower petals at its feet. She whispered things to it when she thought Carmen was too far away to hear. And more than once Carmen noticed her granddaughter staring up at the stone face with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite wonder. One evening near the end of July, the sky over San Aurelio turned the color of copper just before sunset. Warm air moved through the courtyard, stirring the jasmine and carrying the distant sound of the church bell from the center of town. Carmen was inside slicing peaches for supper when she realized the courtyard had gone strangely quiet. No humming. No turning of paper pages. No soft conversation with the stuffed rabbit. Only silence. She stepped into the doorway and saw Lucia, sitting perfectly still on the wooden bench, facing the statue. Lucia, Carmen called gently. What are you doing, Corazon? The girl did not answer at once. Then, without turning, she whispered, Why is she crying? A faint chill moved through Carmen despite the heat. She walked down the short stone path and stopped beside the bench. Lucia was staring directly at the statue's face. She isn't crying, Carmen said softly. It must be the light. Lucia lifted one small hand and pointed. There was water on her face. Carmen stepped closer. The statue stood exactly as it always had. Pale stone, lowered eyes, quiet hands. The last sunlight touched its cheeks and made the features look softer than usual. Carmen pressed her fingertips against one cheek. Dry? Completely dry. See, she said, glancing back at the child. Nothing there. Lucia frowned. I saw it. Sometimes evening light makes things look different. The girl said nothing more, but as they went back inside for supper, she turned once and looked over her shoulder toward the statue among the white roses. That night, a storm rolled over the hills. Thunder traveled across the valley like wagons on stone. Rain struck the rooftops and overflowed the gutters. Wind rattled the shutters and bent the jasmine against the rear wall of the courtyard. Carmen barely slept. Storms unsettled her now in a way they never had when Esteban was still alive. In thunder, the house always felt older, emptier, too aware of the silence left behind by the dead. By dawn, the storm had passed. The air smelled washed clean. Pale sunlight filtered through retreating clouds above the hills. Carmen took a watering can outside, expecting broken stems, wet petals, and puddles near the base of the rose bushes. She crossed the courtyard slowly. Then she stopped. At first, she thought what she saw on the statue's face was only the reflection of morning light. But the closer she came, the clearer it became. Two thin, wet lines ran from the statue's eyes down along its cheeks. They looked exactly like tears. Carmen stared for several long seconds without moving. The shoulders and base of the statue were damp in the ordinary way stone remained damp after rain, but these two lines seemed different. Finer, brighter, newly formed. She set the watering can down beside the bench. Then, almost afraid to touch it, she reached out with trembling fingers and brushed the stone beneath one eye. It was wet, truly wet. Cool moisture clung to her fingertips. Behind her came the soft sound of footsteps. Lucia had followed her outside. The little girl stopped near the doorway and looked toward the statue. For a moment she said nothing. Then, very quietly, she whispered, I told you. Carmen did not answer. She could only stand there, staring at the pale stone face and the shining tracks running down its cheeks, while the first sunlight of morning filled the courtyard. And somewhere deep inside her, before a single word had passed beyond the garden wall, she knew that life in San Aurelio had just begun to change. Carmen tried to convince herself that what she had seen that morning was nothing unusual. After all, the storm during the night had been strong. Rain had fallen for hours across the hills surrounding San Aurelio. Water could easily have gathered in some small crack in the stone and slowly moved downward when the sunlight returned. Stone was unpredictable sometimes. It held moisture in strange places. That was what she told herself. Still, the image of those thin, wet lines running down the statue's cheeks remained in her thoughts all morning. Before breakfast, she wiped the statue's face gently with a cloth. The stone felt cool beneath her fingers, and once the moisture disappeared, the statue looked completely ordinary again. Its calm expression returned, silent and unchanged among the white roses. Lucia watched from the wooden bench, but did not say anything. The morning passed quietly. Carmen watered the plants. Lucia sat beneath the fig tree drawing in her notebook, while her stuffed rabbit rested beside her on the warm stones. For several hours, nothing strange happened. By midday, Carmen had almost convinced herself that the entire moment had been nothing more than imagination. Then, late in the afternoon, it happened again. Lucia noticed it first. She had been sitting near the statue watching butterflies drift between the lavender flowers when she suddenly stood up. Abuela, she called softly. Carmen looked up from the clay pots she was arranging along the wall. What is it? Lucia pointed toward the statue. The lady is crying again. Carmen felt her stomach tighten. She walked slowly toward the center of the courtyard, trying to appear calm. But as she approached the statue, she saw it immediately. Two small droplets were forming beneath the statue's stone eyes. They clung to the pale surface for a moment. Then they began sliding slowly down the face. Exactly like tears. Carmen reached out and touched the stone again. It was wet, yet the rest of the statue was completely dry under the warm afternoon sun. For several seconds, she said nothing. Behind her, Lucia spoke quietly. "She's sad." Carmen forced a small smile. "It must be humidity," she said. But even to her own ears, the explanation sounded uncertain. That evening a neighbor stopped by. Don Rafael, who lived 2 houses down the street, had come to return a ladder he had borrowed earlier in the week. He was a retired mason with thick gray eyebrows and a voice that carried across courtyards even when he tried to speak softly. "Carmen," he called through the open gate. "Your ladder survived my roof repairs." Carmen walked over and greeted him with a polite smile. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. While they spoke near the courtyard wall, Lucia suddenly ran toward them. "Don Rafael," she said excitedly. "Come see." The old man chuckled. "What have you discovered now?" "The lady," Lucia said, pointing toward the statue. "She's crying." Raphael followed her slowly, smiling as though he expected to find nothing more than a child's imagination. But when he reached the flower bed, his smile disappeared. He leaned forward. The late afternoon sunlight illuminated the statue clearly. And there, beneath the carved stone eyes, 2 small shining lines were sliding downward along the pale cheeks. Raphael reached out and touched the stone carefully with one finger. He rubbed the moisture between his thumb and forefinger. "It's water," he murmured. Carmen nodded slowly. "But only there." The old mason stepped back and stared again. "Well," he said quietly after a moment, "that is something I have never seen before." He crossed himself instinctively. That night Raphael told his wife about what he had seen. His wife told her sister. And by the next morning, nearly everyone in San Aurelio had heard about the statue that seemed to cry in Carmen Valdez's courtyard. At first, only a few curious neighbors came to look. 2 women from the bakery stopped by after finishing work. A teenage boy passing on his bicycle paused at the open gate. Most expected to find nothing unusual, but several of them saw the same thing. Small droplets forming beneath the statue's eyes. The reactions were different. Some visitors grew silent and crossed themselves. Others leaned closer to examine the stone for cracks. A few laughed nervously and insisted it must be condensation. Carmen watched them all with growing unease. "I don't understand it," she told everyone who asked. "It has never happened before." Lucia remained the calmest person in the courtyard. She often sat quietly on the wooden bench while visitors came and went, watching the statue with the same thoughtful curiosity she had shown from the beginning. Sometimes she whispered softly to it. One afternoon Carmen finally asked her about it. "What do you say to her?" she asked gently. Lucia shrugged. "Nothing important." "Then why do you talk?" The little girl looked toward the statue. "She listens." "Listens to what?" "To people." Carmen felt a small chill move down her spine. Before she could ask anything more, the courtyard gate creaked open again. 2 more neighbors had arrived. They stood silently among the rose bushes staring at the pale stone figure. And once again, beneath the statue's eyes, the thin shining lines began to form. By the end of that week, nearly everyone in San Aurelio had heard about the strange tears in Carmen's courtyard. Most believed there had to be a simple explanation, but none of them could explain why the statue cried only on its face. And none of them knew that the story was only beginning, because soon someone from outside the town would arrive. And what that visitor would experience in Carmen's courtyard would change everything. Within a few days, the quiet rhythm of San Aurelio began to change. At first, the visitors came only from nearby streets. Neighbors who had already heard the strange story stepped cautiously through Carmen's small courtyard gate, pretending they were simply passing by. They would pause beside the rose bushes, glance at the statue, whisper among themselves, and leave with uncertain expressions. But small towns do not keep secrets for long. A baker told a delivery driver. A delivery driver told a shopkeeper in the next village. And soon the story traveled beyond San Aurelio's narrow streets. People began arriving from neighboring towns. Some came out of curiosity. Others came quietly, carrying small flowers or rosaries in their hands. Carmen never invited anyone, but she also never turned anyone away. "I don't know what it means," she told everyone honestly. "I'm only seeing the same thing you are." Lucia often sat quietly on the wooden bench beside the statue while the visitors moved around the courtyard. She watched them carefully, as though studying each face. Sometimes the statue remained dry for hours. Then suddenly the tiny droplets would appear again beneath its stone eyes. Each time it happened, the courtyard would fall silent. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the first tears appeared, a woman arrived who had traveled farther than anyone else so far. Her name was Maria Torres. She was 55 years old and lived in a town nearly 50 kilometers away. Illness had slowly weakened her over the past 2 years, leaving her pale and thin, with movements that seemed careful and measured, as though every step required effort. Her sister had heard about the statue on the radio and insisted they come. They arrived in a small, dusty car late in the afternoon. Maria walked slowly through the gate, her hand resting on her sister's arm for support. The courtyard was quiet that day. Only a few villagers stood near the wall speaking softly. Lucia sat on the bench, swinging her feet. Carmen greeted the visitors politely. "Welcome," she said gently. "You may come closer if you like." Maria nodded but did not speak. Her eyes remained fixed on the statue, standing among the lavender flowers. She moved forward slowly. Then she knelt. The courtyard fell completely silent. For several minutes Maria prayed quietly, her head bowed and her hands clasped tightly together. No one moved. Even the faint breeze in the olive branches seemed to fade. Lucia watched her carefully. Carmen felt a strange tension in the air she could not explain. Then Maria suddenly lifted her head. Her eyes widened. "The tears," she whispered. Everyone stepped closer, and there they were. 2 clear droplets had appeared beneath the statue's eyes. They moved slowly down the pale stone face, catching the warm afternoon sunlight. Maria carefully raised her hand. For a moment she hesitated. Then she touched one of the falling drops with her fingertip. Her expression changed instantly. "It's warm," she said quietly. The words spread through the courtyard like a ripple across water. "Warm," someone repeated. Maria looked at her hand again, as though trying to understand what she felt. "Yes," she said softly. "Not cold like rain warm." One of the younger visitors lifted his phone and began recording. Carmen felt a strange unease growing inside her. She had never wanted attention. The courtyard had always been a peaceful place, meant only for quiet moments and memories of the past. But now people were whispering excitedly. Within hours, the video recorded that afternoon began spreading across social media. Within a day, people far beyond San Aurelio had seen the statue's tears. And by the end of the week, the quiet little town found itself at the center of a growing mystery. Cars began arriving earlier each morning. Visitors lined the narrow road near Carmen's house. Some brought candles. Some brought flowers. Others brought Carmen never had an answer. Meanwhile, Lucia continued sitting quietly beside the statue each evening. One night, after the last visitors had gone home and the courtyard had finally returned to silence, Carmen sat beside her on the wooden bench. "Lucia," she asked softly, "do you still talk to her?" The little girl looked toward the statue. The moonlight rested gently on the pale stone face. "Yes," she said. "And what does she say?" Lucia was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke in the calm voice only children sometimes have. "She says people are very sad." Carmen felt a chill run down her back. "And that's why she cries?" Carmen asked. Lucia shook her head slowly. "No." The little girl looked up at the statue again. "She cries so people will notice." Carmen did not sleep well that night, because by then the story of the statue had already begun spreading across the country. And the next visitors who would arrive in San Aurelio would not come simply to pray. They would come to investigate. By the beginning of autumn, San Aurelio no longer felt like the quiet hill town it had always been. Cars arrived before sunrise. Some visitors traveled for hours to reach the small village. Others arrived in buses organized by churches from distant cities. The narrow streets that had once been nearly empty now filled with strangers speaking softly in different accents, all asking for directions to the same place. Carmen Valdez's courtyard. Reporters began appearing soon after. White television vans parked beside the bakery in the town square. Journalists stood in front of cameras describing the strange phenomenon that had captured the attention of the entire country. The Weeping Virgin of San Aurelio, some of them called it. Carmen disliked the name. To her, it was still simply the statue Esteban had carried home all those years ago. But the world outside the village no longer saw it that way. Every day people lined up quietly outside the courtyard gate. Some carried flowers. Some brought candles. Others held photographs of loved ones they wanted to pray for. A few visitors knelt silently for long minutes. Others cried. Many simply stared at the statue, hoping to see the tears appear. Sometimes they did. Not every hour. Not even every day. But often enough that hundreds of witnesses now claim to have seen the small droplets forming beneath the stone eyes. The mystery only grew. Eventually, scientists arrived. A research team from a university in Madrid asked Carmen for permission to examine the statue more closely. They brought cameras, microscopes, humidity sensors, and small instruments designed to detect hidden moisture inside stone. Carmen agreed. "I want to understand it too," she told them. For 2 full days they studied the statue carefully. They examined every surface. They measured the air in the courtyard. They tested the stone itself. But when their investigation ended, they had no clear answer. "There may be a natural explanation," one researcher said carefully while speaking to reporters outside the gate. "But at the moment we cannot identify the exact cause." That uncertainty only made the story spread further. Soon visitors were arriving not only from other parts of Spain, but from other countries as well. Despite everything, Carmen tried to keep life as normal as possible. Each morning she watered the flowers. Each evening she sat beside Lucia on the wooden bench in the quiet moments after the crowds had gone home. And always the statue stood silently among the roses and lavender, watching. Then one evening in late September, something happened that no one expected. The day had been unusually busy. Nearly 100 visitors had passed through the courtyard, leaving flowers and candles around the statue's base. By sunset, most of them had returned to their hotels or buses. Only a handful of people remained. The air was calm. The hills surrounding San Aurelio glowed with the last golden light of evening. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell rang slowly across the valley. Lucia sat on the bench beside Carmen, swinging her feet gently. Then suddenly the girl stood up. "Abuela," she said quietly. Carmen turned. Lucia was looking at the statue again. Several of the remaining visitors noticed and stepped closer. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then someone gasped. 2 clear droplets appeared beneath the statue's eyes. They formed slowly, then began sliding down the pale stone cheeks. The entire courtyard fell silent. Lucia walked toward the statue. She stood directly in front of it, looking up calmly at the stone face. Then she spoke softly. "It's okay." Carmen frowned slightly. "What do you mean, Corazon?" Lucia didn't turn around. "She says people heard her." The visitors exchanged confused glances. Carmen stepped closer. "Heard what?" she asked. Lucia finally looked back at her grandmother. "She says people remember now." No one spoke. The last 2 drops slid down the statue's face. And then something remarkable happened. The tears stopped. Completely. Days passed. Then weeks. Visitors continued arriving, hoping to see the statue cry again. But the stone face remained dry. Scientists returned once more to examine it, but they found nothing different. Gradually the crowds began to shrink. The reporters stopped visiting. The buses disappeared from the narrow roads. Little by little, San Aurelio returned to the quiet rhythm it had known for generations. Yet something had changed. Many of the people who had visited Carmen's courtyard said the experience had altered them in ways they couldn't fully explain. Some began helping neighbors they had ignored for years. Some returned to churches they had once abandoned. Others simply said the strange story reminded them that compassion still mattered. As for Carmen, she never claimed to understand what had happened. Whenever someone asked if she believed the tears had been a miracle, she always gave the same answer. "I don't know," she would say gently. Then she would look toward the statue standing peacefully among the roses. "But I do know one thing." For a little while, people stopped and listened. Lucia still visited the courtyard bench in the evenings. Sometimes Carmen asked her whether the lady still spoke. Lucia would smile and shake her head. "She doesn't need to anymore," the girl once said. And in the quiet garden at the edge of San Aurelio, the statue of the Virgin Mary stood silently once again. But the story of the summer when it cried would never completely disappear, because hundreds of people had seen the tears, and every one of them left the garden believing something different about hope.